All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining me today. My name is Stan Evans, and I'm an advertising photographer out of Los Angeles. But what most people don't realize is I have a long history in shooting winter sports. I grew up in Alaska, and nature has always fueled my narrative. And I wanted to share that experience. And a few months ago, I walked into the North Face with a few ideas on how to get more Black people, marginalized communities into the outdoors. And so here we are. So over the next month, I'll be hosting 4 actually YouTube lives. We've done 2 already. This is our second one. And we'll be discussing diversity and inclusion in the outdoors. And my first guest today, well, second guest, is Conrad Anker, who really honestly needs no introduction. When you look up OG of mountain climbing, his picture is in the dictionary. And to be completely honest, he's been on as many mountaintops as Martin Luther King's speech has been repeated. So your accolades are honestly fascinating. Probably most of the people who have been here kind of familiar with what you do. But for me, what I really want to explore today is the shift in your philosophy and narrative as going from exploring high peaks to exploring culture and humanity, and how you're doing that as an ambassador for the North Face, and how we can actually look at getting more people into that community.
Yeah, thanks, Stan, for the introduction, and thanks all of you for tuning in on this day and wherever you are around the world. So, yeah, welcome to this, where we are and how we communicate in this day and age. And it's really wonderful to be here, Stan, and our connections. And it's like we've always known of each other, but our orbits were just slightly a little not lining up. And you're riding down mountains, I'm climbing up mountains, but we have all these mutual friends and the same things that you and I both care for. That's something that is uniform, and by combining our voices, we have this great opportunity to create goodwill.
For sure. And I think of something that a lot of people don't know, and the common ground that we actually share is we both spent a lot of time in Bozeman. So I lived in Bozeman for 9 years, actually graduated from Montana State University. And kind of how I actually came to know the North Face and working with some of their athletes is Jason Schutz, who actually still lives there, was a huge mentor in my life. Like, he's literally like kind of like the godfather of like extreme snowboarding. Like, and a lot of people don't really understand or know his history in snowboarding or just honestly extreme sports. And so through him, he kind of introduced me to Alex Lowe, who obviously you've got a huge connection with as your main climbing partner and good friend. And so between those two, I actually personally knew Alex because he worked out at the same gym that I worked at. It's like Bozeman Athletic Club was connected to the Rocky Mountain Roasting Company. And so I would see him, he would come in, and it's just such an interesting, fascinating thing about Alex was he is such a jovial person, but just boundless energy. And so for me, looking at that and kind of trying to understand like the outdoor world and navigate that world and trying to start my career in it, I took a lot of tips from him. But he was insane. He would go skin up Bridger Bowl before the lifts were open. A lot of times he would go ski Schlushmans before it was open, you know, because they just expanded that area. And then he'd come in and he'd do to the gym, and he'd literally break off like 100 pull-ups, like right there. And so just seeing that whole narrative, how about he carried himself and how he went about his way in the outdoors and how he was super friendly and gave me words of encouragement, really kind of like made him a hero for me, even though at the time I was just really young, but that he just took the time to talk to a young person like me who was trying to understand the outdoors. And so that's where my relationship with Alex really began. And so through that, Jason mentored me more as far as like getting into the snowboard career and learning backcountry and route finding and avalanche control and avalanche procedure and just getting photos. I'm like, he really helped me out in that space. I'm like, he was actually one of the first people I ever got an ad published of with the North Face. So I just think it's a really interesting like dynamic of like the connection between you and I.
Yeah, it's a great history there with that. And Alex was certainly one of the more ebullient and effusive and happy people that we've known. Is certainly a force of nature. But that brings to mind that mentorship doesn't necessarily have to be this long term, day in, day out. You're coming there, oh, we're going to do something like that. It can be an affirmation of someone's life goals that at that right moment where you're like, yeah, you should pursue this. There is those connections that really can have an influence later in life.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was an inspiration of seeing what was possible, and then honestly, like just procedurally, he got me thinking of a different way of like of strength to mass ratio. Because from where I'd come from, you like think of things like football players or like gladiators, like put on as much muscle as possible and be heavy and strong. And here was this person who was very lit, very strong. Like he was like Bruce Lee. Like like it was to me, he was like the reincarnation, because
Yeah.
this person who had this undeniable strength. Like seeing in person is just like a different thing than people actually talking or reading about him. To see it in person is just like it transformed the way I thought about how I would go about in the backcountry. It actually made me think more about endurance and power to weight ratio and things that I was carrying in the backcountry so I could actually get my job done. Because when I'm out there, I was carrying camera gear, I was carrying first aid gear, I was carrying food, you're carrying safety rappel gear. And so you have to look at what you can carry for your load for what your actually strength and endurance will be for the day. And that philosophy really came from Alex.
Yeah, definitely. You want to be able to carry yourself for your own weight, and I think mountain sports are all about that. And you've got to get up the mountain and get down it, and so you're not necessarily having to have extra mass that's going to benefit you. So there's that fine balance, and it's also a life sport. I mean, if there's anything we take away from this, is that you plug into that fitness level, and it will continue with you for as long as you practice being outdoors.
For sure. So part of that, and again, the interesting connection is being there and being at a loss. Something that happened to me early on in my career is my sister was killed by a drunk driver. And within that and seeing some of the pain and just the danger of mountain climbing and the nature of it, it kind of shifted my path. And it was like a definite distinctive loss. And it really hurt. It was one of those things where it hurt me and hurt me personally. And then losing Alex in, my hero in climbing really affected me in a like I like cried when he died. Like I was like really saddened. It was something that moved me to tears because here's the person who's become this inspiration and told me that I could do things and encouraged me, and all of a sudden it was gone. And so all of a sudden, like when you have that person, that dream and ideal gone from your life, it's a vacuum. And so I had that with him, and I had it with my sister, and it really changed me. It put me to a really dark place. And there's kind of two things of that, of where working with Jason, because he kind of just was the grandfather of like teaching all the young snowboard kids that were coming out of Bozeman at the time. Like he imparted his knowledge on Annie Fast, Mel Boshoff, Justin Mooney, Chris Ankeny, all these people who are working in outdoor sports now. Like that's a direct descendant of Jason. And so Jason, he actually brought me this book called The Tibetan Book of Dying. And when my sister passed, and he was one of the people who kind of helped get me out of that funk. And being in the mountains, being in the sports, shooting photos, he helped pull me out of that. But within that nature, I had a reckoning with my mom. Like my mom was devastated, heartbroken when my sister died. And while I was looking at this path of climbing, stuff like that, I kind of had to look at it and blink, because realistically, my mom couldn't take a child dying before her. And so I kind of had to like have that presence of mind of what was the best thing for me and what was the best thing for my family. And it became more of a thing of shooting snowboard and then going and approaching high mountain climbing. And it really kind of reincarnated because Han Sari was a friend of mine. He went to college, and we would do road trips, and we go to Beartooth and go skiing and camping. And he was a close friend. And then he passed away in Chamonix like a few years later. And so seeing all these things and kind of repeated and talking to another athlete who's on your team, Chris Erickson, who was a year behind me in school in photography. It was just all these, to be completely honest, like bad, tragic things were happening, and I kind of had to like look at my path and where I was looking at kind of this route of climbing and like exploring that, and dial it back to kind of like what's attainable, what's real here, what can I actually like survive. And honestly, like to be completely honest, outlived my mother because like my mom to this day still can't go to my sister's gravesite. Like it's so traumatic for her. Like she just hasn't really dealt with the loss in that space, and she just could not handle another one. So I found more of a different career in snowboarding where it was a little bit safer, to be completely honest. Not that much, but it dialed it down a notch. And so then I took that route. And so literally the route of Alex passing away and Hans passing away altered my trajectory in the outdoors.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, the non-sequential loss when it happens is devastating, especially if it's a child, your child, or that in your family. And then also if you're in your 20s and 30s, when you have this air of invincibility, you can do anything, and you haven't really understood that. And where I'm at it, in my late 50s, and both my parents have passed away, there is an understanding of mortality and our finite time on this planet. But that loss is a very expensive price to pay for this meaning of we need to live in the moment, we need to be present, and we need to value our friends. And that cost that we pay is brutal in these outdoor sports, but it's also the allure. I mean, we want to go and ride these lines and climb these mountains because there's unknown to it, and that's the draw.
And I think, and that kind of touches on something with my sister or that, because my sister was the bright one. Like, it's funny because she was the smart, like, amazing one. Like, it's a little unknown thing, but my sister was actually the first reporter to cover the Oklahoma City bombing. And so she had really done a great job in her career as far as a newscaster and a journalist. And so she was just making waves in that industry. And like, in the meantime, I was like a ski bum, like waiting tables, you know, like, but losing her really made me focus. All of a sudden I was like, okay, I've got to do this. Like, it really polarized. And so it became something of like, it made it personal because I was working on trying to become a great photographer in honor of her, of like a legacy that she left, of like, you know, it's like, I have to take over this torch and the mantle. So it drove me to succeed. Like, it drove me like, it was just one of those things, like every single day I knew what my purpose was, what I was going out there to do, which a lot of people really didn't realize that about me. But, you know, when you have someone taken away, it makes you find your path sometimes.
Yeah. Learn from it. Yeah.
And to honor that legacy in a great way. And it also taught me some valuable lessons of like something that's even going on right now. And like looking at the whole disparity in the outdoors and stuff. It taught me at an early age that life's not fair. And coming to that realization, it's a harsh one, but it's what do you do with that knowledge once you've actually like realized that life's not fair? Do you let that like take you down, or do you actually like resolve to do the best you can within the dynamics that you have and try and do better, even though you know like not necessarily things are always fair all the time? And so I was constantly pushing against that. Just being the only Black winter photographer like that is like, I just wasn't going to let it beat me. It strengthened my resolve and my determination, because I knew life wasn't fair, but I know that I could make a difference here.
Yeah, you can either take that information and grouse about it and be sour grapes and life is this and that, or you can be like, okay, this is where we're starting from. This is where we need to go. This is what we have to do to create that change. And I think you and I are both on that optimist. Like, we're going to get out there and we're going to find what these challenges are and work through them.
That's what fascinated me about this story of looking at your path after Alex, that you continued on, create all these great relationships in the North Bays. You're mentoring all these different athletes, and you continue to do good, you know. And so, like, although we haven't met until just now, looking at your content and looking at that parallel, it kind of made me realize where I needed to go as far as my parallel of what needs to be done. So I was like, if you can continue on that and through that whole scenario, then I can continue.
Yeah, thanks. And it was October 5th, 1999 that we were on Tibet with a trip with Hans and Chris Erickson and skiing when an avalanche came down and took the lives of David Bridges and Alex Lowe. And it was, for me, at age 35 or whatever, and I mean, the wheels came off. I had no idea what was going on. And one, there's the trauma of the immediate moment and getting pummeled by an avalanche and thinking that lights were out and then kind of walking away from it. And then there was the loss, the survivor's weight of missing my two friends. And so there's a lot of internal dialogue that goes with that. And if anything, it's I realized that I'm here for other people on this planet. And the more that I can help other people and be there for them, and that creates a happiness for me. And in that sense, finding love with Jennifer and being with her and getting married. We got married in April of 2000, and then raising the boys has been this wonderful journey that it gives me an example with that. And now where I'm at with in seeing when loss happens into our community, especially in the young adventurers there, that I can be there for them. And the metaphor that I use, the bear of depression, and to keep that bear in the den and be friends with it, know what it is, but find ways that you can accept it and get on with your life and not let it become overly dominant.
And I think, again, like looking at that parallel path, like that's how I felt with my sister, and I didn't know what to do. And so by that nature of like Jason and then watching you, because literally it was like at the same time, like it was parallel. And so watching from afar, seeing how you were dealing with it definitely helped me with how I dealt with my sister's loss, and like still trying to carry a career and do things and try and be helpful to a community and to people around me. So thank you. I just want to say kind of from afar, I appreciate that.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, kind of you to think of that.
So the other thing that we were talking about the other day was climate change. So I know you've been working diligently with Protect Our Winters, and I kind of want to talk a little bit about that, but if you can kind of, I guess, go into the work that you're doing, and then maybe I can kind of extrapolate on kind of my views on that.
Yeah. So probably in the mid 80s, or when Mr. Henson with NASA and the climate change came out with the modeling of how we're changing the world, I was like, wow, we're seeing this in the mountains. Whether you're in Alaska or the Himalayas, you see glaciers melting, and we have a historical record from when routes were first climbed. So there's that connection that is to our sports. And then Jeremy Jones, who's a writer and your friend, and from one of the OGs, in 2007 started Protect Our Winters, and then 2012 invited me to be part of as a board member with it. And it hopefully is using outdoor recreation, winter recreation, and more broadly now public lands recreation to connect with the millennial generation, and to be, hey, climate change is real. You have permission, you have responsibility, and you have tools to talk about it. And we're not perfect. One of the things is don't let great or good get in the way of perfect, because you could say, yeah, we all consume carbon, things like that, and we're working to it. But being able to elevate the dialogue and to see that with this next generation of outdoor enthusiasts, in turn, citizens of our societies, builders of our societies, leaders of our societies, and contributors to our society, to have that responsibility about climate change it's been a good movement.
Nice. And it's interesting because I have a little bit of a different narrative on the whole take of that. And I've kind of seen a few flaws, just from my perspective, being a person, black outdoorsman per se, right? Because I feel like in the messaging and some of the stuff, and especially with climate change, and not necessarily just to protect our awareness, but in climate change in general, they're not really marketing to minorities and talking about the effects that they're going to have on that population and the regional effects that on these people. And what got me thinking about this is I was watching a special with Van Jones and Neil deGrasse Tyson. And in my mind's eye, when I've been thinking about protect our winters, my whole thing was like, you know, not gonna be able to ski, you're not gonna be able to snowboard, blah, blah, which, you know, like we'd still live, you know, per se.
Those are sports of privilege. Yeah. We'll be really honest with it.
Yeah.
So,
and so talking with Neil deGrasse Tyson, he was talking about how the glaciers melting will raise the floodwaters. So then all of a sudden, what dawned on me is it'll actually like take out coastal cities. Like it will wipe out those communities. It will take people's homes away. It'll take away jobs. And so looking at that, that's where more minorities are going to be affected. And I was just like, why aren't more minorities talking about this? Because when I look at it, social media channels, I look at how it's advertised, that no one's talking about it. Like they see the poster child of Greta Thunberg, but then there's another climate change activist called Vanessa Nakade. And it's interesting how they go about marketing the two different climate change people, because Vanessa, a lot of times when they have the groups of the climate change activists together, they're cropping her out of the photo. Like they're literally, like they just crop it in so they wouldn't show the black activists like that. But to get black people involved, you actually have to show black people getting involved, what the effects are, how it's going to affect them, because let's be honest, there's not a lot of black people out snowboarding and skiing, but it's going to affect us all. And, you know, it's going to change our lives probably more so than people who have affluence who can move to higher ground per se.
Yeah, right? Great observation, Stan. And that's one of the challenges that we were talking about, being able to identify where you want to work and how you want to address it. And yeah, the environmental movement is overwhelmingly white. It's upper middle class. It's college educated. The motivation is like, oh, we need to preserve the park so we can enjoy the trees, and then skiing and snowboarding. We need winter so we can have our recreation. And very clear about climate change and the long-term effect in 20, 40 years, it will affect people of color and the BIPOC community far more than it will the affluent. So if you live in a ski resort town and yeah, the winter's a little bit shorter, but you still have a nice house and you have all these things for that. But if you are in the Mississippi Delta and there's an increased hurricane season, and with that flooding that has a direct economic effect on you. If you live in Cancer Alley on the Mississippi River, or in the refineries are given a reprieve by the EPA, allowing them to pollute more, you will have a higher cancer rate because of who you are and where that community is. And in that same measure, how climate change is so real, and we're seeing it, that it also affects farmers. And so how can we get the ag community, the community of faith, the community of color to be part of this conversation and to find ways to work towards a more equitable future? And that is, I see that from my travels to Nepal. Mm-hmm. Granted, I burn a bunch of carbon. I do a voluntary tax with a carbon offset for my vacations there. But when I communicate with my Nepali friends, they is what is referred to in climate policy is a victim nation. So they're a tiny landlocked nation between India and China, and 27 million people, and their per capita carbon output is quite small. But, and we look at per person carbon consumption is that's the one we need to look at, because we use a lot more energy here in the United States than, say, someone in sub-Saharan Africa. So, and we need to value human life, and that's where it's really key on that. But in Nepal, they're like, well, we're suffering the consequences of climate change. We're having increased flooding. Our seasons are not as reliable as they were. The monsoon is disruptive. It does not help with the agriculture, recreation aside. And so, and in Nepal, there's not this, oh, we need to talk about both sides of climate change. It's like, no, climate change is real. what are we doing as a nation? And then they look at me as a guest and like, what are you doing? And the problem's coming from the United States and North America, Europe, parts of Asia that have a more consumeristic standard of living, and turning that to where we need to realize that climate change isn't something that is only that is spoken by and for upper white middle class people, but rather for everyone, and realizing that the effects of it are going to they're going to affect more people, and people of low income and marginalized communities.
And so here's where I actually have come with a little bit, because I want to put context with this, right? And when you think about like numbers game, because I mean, like, I'll be honest, like, I like to win, you know, like I'm like those people who want to look good doing it, and then there's people who just want to win as far as like goes. And so I don't know necessarily like at that, but thinking about tactics and marketing, how you go about doing it, like, let's look at protect our winners and some of the people they've got as far as climate change. So you've got Travis Rice, right? Let's say he goes and signs everyone up in Jackson Hole, who's got a population of 10,427 people, right? But then let's look at another snowboarder, black girl, Gabby Maiden, who's from Inglewood, and she goes and signs up her whole area of Inglewood. They've got 108,695 people there. It's a numbers game. Same thing with Jeremy Jones. Jeremy can go get everyone in Tahoe signed up and kind of moving to that stage. It's 21,000 people. You go look at Nigel Sylvester, BMXer from Queens, that's 2.3 million people. So if you start looking at the numbers game and how to actually go about combating this from numbers game, you actually need to get Black people involved. And when you look at it this way, we look at all the civil rights marches that have been happening around Black Lives Matter, right? I look at it this way. It's like, hey, let's go get climate change people to help us with racism, because here's the inherent threat right now. Black people are dealing with racism right now. Like, I can walk out of my house and be a victim of police brutality, but climate change is something 30 years from now for me that might kill me later. So I'm kind of worried about the threat that's right outside my door. And so then if you actually help with racism, then all of a sudden we can all become united to actually work on climate change. And you've got everyone together actually working on climate change then. And so when you look at that, look at all the celebrities right now that are tweeting about SARS, right? You've got Beyonce, Michael B. Jordan, Lewis Hamilton. Not one of them has tweeted about climate change because they don't see the immediate threat. So the whole thing about it is looking up how you can mobilize that community to have an effect on climate change and let them know the threat is out there and it's going to affect them. And I think that comes down to voting, with people like talking about voting as far as it goes, like with Trump and Biden and so forth. Right? There's the immediate like, oh, like we're dealing with racism as far as like Donald Trump. Like, it's obvious that he does not like Black people. So, well, you might want to vote another way because of your tax bracket or anything like that. But then you're actually talking about climate change. But when you look at it, who's rolled back all the environmental policies that are going on in America right now? Trump. So while you might get your tax break now, if there's not a world for your kids to live in, they're not really going to get much of your inheritance. So we kind of actually have to think about what we need to do now, and then go about voting for Biden, 1, for race, and then 2, for environmentalism, so we can actually bring back some of the protections that go to these areas that you're talking about, like the deltas, like drilling in Alaska, like Flint, Michigan regulations on water. And so when you look at that, the biggest thing that we can actually do is mobilizing to vote right now and then join together to steer climate change. And so I kind of look at it in a different way just because of my perspective. And like, I'm a bit frustrated because I know people aren't necessarily talking to this community, but also I want to help. So I'm like, how can we actually go about tangibly winning this and making it a better world for all of us?
Yeah, great overview there, Stan. And I'm with you. That's why we're on this call and we're generating ideas, and we can do that. The intersectionality between environment and race is very real. And COVID is now part of that. And I mean, COVID is a result of environment, human encroachment on wild places, and the consumption of wild meat. And so all of this ties back to the environment, and humans, by where we are from an evolutionary vantage point, we deal with immediate threats. So it might have been a predator that would scare us, or it might have been an enemy. And so we process that in a very immediate sense. But we are now, when we look at something like climate change, when you try to explain to someone, well, atmospheric CO2 is now at 415 parts per million, and where it was 150 years ago is at this level, it's intangible. I mean, the sky still blue up there, and there might be fires or something like that, but there's not this immediate connection to it. And being able to change your actions that benefit future generations, that's something that takes time and practice and dedication. And for you and I, Stan, our pivot came to that when we went through loss. And that was, again, coming back to that high price to pay for a life lesson. But we've taken that as a flywheel to address these issues.
All right. Well, Conrad, let's let the healing begin.
Yeah, I'm all with it. I'm like, let's make things happen. Let's stir it up. Let's the late Representative John Lewis, let's bring on some good trouble, because
I like that
we're not going to get anywhere just by sitting on the side. And it's the same thing. The only way you got those great shots was to get out there and get up early and plan ahead. And that's how we do things.
And I love just like the one-on-one of us communicating, and like, what can we do? Where can we lend our voice? Where can we actually have direct impact? Because that's how I like to move in this world. As far as like that, I don't want to post a black square. I don't want to send a donation or post things. Like, I kind of just like want to do things. I want to make things happen. Like, and so that's kind of how I work per se. Like, sometimes moving in silence to actually get a result, rather than virtue signaling actually has a better effect, and I think that's the one thing that's interesting. Like, and I'll just get to it right now. Right now, there's like a lot of like, okay, there's like, pledge this or do this or kind of do that, or come about to this way of thinking, or live your life like, like, what can you do now? I'm like, it's been a little bit interesting because I've been trying to live my life like this the whole way, and honestly just looking at where I can, like, how can you be a better human? Like, how can you be a better human? I think it's like, you have to like look in the mirror and like really like assess and look at yourself. I'm like, I've got my flaws, man. Like, like, I definitely do, but I also know and look where I can be better and do stuff. And having that, I'm like, across America, I think everyone kind of needs to actually have that reckoning,
Yeah. And that's, you're better looking at yourself if you're humble and you don't approach it with from an antagonistic standpoint. And that's what being outdoors. I mean, if you forget your gloves, you're going to have cold hands. So you've learned better from it. And if you're not going through that practice, then it doesn't make you empathetic to other people.
No, for sure. One of the other topics I really wanted to talk to you about was the recent kind of like the recent talk about John Muir and his like relationship with the outdoors and his racist past. So I kind of have an interesting take on that, because one, I find it super ironic, right? So he went about to go and creating the national parks and stuff like that. But the funny thing that a lot of people don't know is the irony of John Muir is the Buffalo Soldiers were the custodians of the West for like the Sequoia and Yosemite National Park. So you had a bunch of like black dudes on horseback policing the area and creating national parks. And so it's a lot of people don't know that. And I think kind of thing, rather than diving into John Muir's past and where his philosophy and like thinking this is something only for white people, I think it's interesting that the people who were protecting these lands were black soldiers.
Yeah. And there's Yosemite National Park before it became a national park, and it was a state park. The connection with the Buffalo soldier. Yeah, reconciling with who John Muir was and what he was able to do in terms of parks and nature. It's very difficult because you can say, well, we're going to be revisionist. It was a period of the times, but there were people that lived at that time that did not have those points of view and that were separate of it. And so it's definitely something that is to understand, but rather than just getting, spinning in this morass of negativity and addressing that when it needs to be, your narrative of finding this great story of the Buffalo Soldier and elevating the stories of, for instance, Black explorers, Henson and Crenshaw, and what they were able to do. And so going towards the positive rather than dwelling on the negative.
And I think it's a thing of like really highlighting Black history and like changing the narrative of like having people understand there are Black outdoorsmen. There's a huge amount of them. Yeah. Like the fact that like the whole Smokey Bear uniform and Park Rangers uniform were derived from the Buffalo Soldiers. That Charles Young was the superintendent of the national parks for Sequoia National Park. And while he was there, he stopped poaching. He built more roads in one summer than all the crews had built before him in 3 years. And the ironic thing of the Buffalo Soldiers is they were disbanded before World War I because they didn't want to have soldiers integrated fighting because they thought that they would actually have to give Black people the rights if they fought in war, and that was segregation. So actually they forced Charles Young to retire, and because he would have to, at his stage of where he was in his career, he would have been able to be commissioned to lead officers in World War I, and so they didn't want that to happen. And so to prove his worthiness, he rode 500 miles horseback to go to the Secretary of the Army to plead his case to be reinstated. And they heard his case, but they didn't reinstate him.
Oh, dedication.
Yeah.
Anyone that would have, and we look at the great role models that we have within the natural space. Ranger Selton from Yosemite, that was part of the National Parks documentary, and really carried that story and was able to bring people in there. And that we have finding these leaders and creating the leaders in the next generation. And that's where you and I can work together, and you and I, speaking collectively, everyone that's in this conversation here, that we can choose individual actions that will elevate people and that will change the narrative. And that's something that if you have that as a priority and you do it day in and day out, you will be an agent for change.
For sure. And it's just telling those daily stories and actually getting it passed down. So here's a funny, interesting story, right? So my dad is retired. He's a retired colonel in the Army, and now he works at Oklahoma University Law School. And he was a commander of the base of Fort Leavenworth. And when they transferred power over to him, all these old Black guys in uniform showed up. And he didn't really understand what was going on, kind of like talking about it. And so when they showed up, he like went over and started talking to them because they had like their full battle dress regalia. And he talked to them, and they're like, yeah, we're like the Buffalo Soldiers, and we never thought that we'd actually see in history a Black commander of this base, so we wanted to come out to honor you. And so my dad, because I befriended them and learned all about their history, and because of all the things he's done within the community and so on and so forth, they actually made him an honorary Buffalo Soldier. And so, yeah. Because like when I was a kid, like I didn't really understand it, and like if you go around our house, there's like all these weird like Buffalo Soldier paintings everywhere, and like statues and like books and stuff like that. Like, I don't know, it's funny. I was just home. My dad like gave me this book. He's like, read this. So like I literally went to go home to go like learn about this stuff, and actually would talk to him before doing a speech. And I just sat down and asked my dad. I was like, so tell me about the Buffalo Soldiers. And he's like, you need to go look up this. You need to go do this. You need to check out this person. And so having that legacy of like my dad being able to pass that down to me, and also my dad taking us to Alaska changed my life. Like he was in the military in the Army, and he introduced me to this whole world, which shaped my narrative. And It was funny. I didn't actually even remember, but he told me about this like 6-day canoe trip that he took me on when I was a kid. And he was like, yeah, we were just paddling around. We had to paddle our food in and paddle out. And I totally forgotten about the trip. And he just totally recanted the whole thing of like this outdoor experience of like me and my father canoe camping in Alaska. And it was just one of those things where like it's such a vague but distinct memory at the same time of just an awareness of a place and a thing and things that like were so majestic to me as a child that you take them to heart, right? And so that's the whole thing when I look at this and kind of like creating like urban spaces and having urban spaces come into nature spaces. When I go to Bed-Stuy and I see people like throwing garbage in the street and I'm bummed and I ask them like, why are you doing that? They're like, oh, that's like someone else's job, which realistically, like if their uncle or cousin or someone is a garbage man, they literally see that as like they're helping employ that person, right? But they've never actually had a chance to go out to Sequoia National Park or Yosemite National Park or go to Alaska and see the beauty that they're constructing. So it's not close to their heart. So my whole thing about it is like, how do we take these things that are out there in nature and make them close to people's hearts in urban communities and vice versa? Because I think in the same way, like you need to take people that are from these outdoor communities so they're not so naive about urban culture and understand that these people have hearts and minds and dreams too, and creating that intersection a little bit better. And that's kind of like what I'm trying to do with this show and with you guys, because I've seen both sides, you know?
Yeah. One of the first steps to increasing the outdoors and making it accessible to everyone would be to all national parks. There's no charge to go in them. And it costs me $80 a year for a park pass. And I pay it. I love the parks, but it's double taxation. And you look at what we pay for our defense. And yes, we love a strong nation and everything like this. But for a portion of that, we could cover what the national park passes get. And then it would be, if there was open to everyone, then it would be, it would mean something. And we see this in parks that are close to urban areas, whether they're in where people will come up, and $20 for a family to come into the park. I mean, that can be a decision-making change between them going into the park. And so if it was, your parks are here for you, this is all public lands, we collectively share it, we respect the indigenous cultures that were first there and the sacredness of that, but that you don't have to pay again to go into these parks.
Well, I look at that, and then also the rewriting of Black history. If you put people like Charles Young in history books, if you put people like, I'm trying to think who else, like, just named them. Sorry, I'm brain farting.
Yeah, I was on a side note, I was reading about Rosa Parks. Now her narrative had been, it's not what it is. And it was like, oh, here's this timid school lady. It was like, no, she gave a damn about what was going on. She wanted to create change. She had a plan. And that was, to have a kid have just the change in that narrative would be like, wow, it gives me permission and responsibility to speak up.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's just like seeing it to be it, right? Even if you're a kid in New York and you read a history book and you see this defiant person like Charles Young leading this charge, he worked in the Spanish Indian War, seeing that, like, it gives a person a sense of pride and a sense of like, I can be that person too, and I can have that path, and they can lead me down these different roads and take me to these different places, because maybe you see that sense of pride and see what this person did in his career, and then it leads you to Sequoia Park. So then maybe you go and visit Sequoia National Park, but it starts with actually putting it into the history books and educating people about what's going on with these Black outdoors, and women. And then if you see that, and all of a sudden, then you become curious, which all of a sudden brings us back to the whole thing of like, what brings us together and binds us together? Curiosity of culture, like caring about humanity, seeing where we can do and where we overlap, and like all of a sudden, like making those bonds a little bit closer and tangible to people. So within that, I mean, kind of like a closing on our talk is like, I want to know how you've been driving diversity in the outdoors and like how I can help.
Yeah, great in there. And so a, um, a shout out and mention to two close friends, James Mills and Phil Henderson. We've been in the outdoor industry since the 80s. James and I were at one time we were like junior sales reps for the North Face, and James has gone on to write and to be part of the Denali climb. And Phil has been a climbing partner and is someone in that. And so knowing my friends, nurturing those friendships, staying in touch with them, listening to them, finding out how we can help each other out, being part of panels like that. And then with Phil, we were in Michigan last February ice climbing, and we had a group of inner city children that had come up from Detroit, and they had no idea that you could go ice climbing or you could do this. And here we were in the Upper Peninsula, and we had this group, and Phil was this wonderful leader, and he's my age. He's got a daughter. He's a mentor, and for these children, it was great. They went ice climbing one day, and the next day they went dog sledding. And for those kids to come back and be like, "Oh yeah, we did this, and it was a good time," and something they can be proud of, that gives them confidence, and that's why we go in the outdoors. So, on my personal level, my friends that I climb with, Manoa here in Bozeman, I cherish those relationships, and I'm also very grateful and thankful to them, and helping myself on a personal level address what we've been going through since late May, June, with the greatest civil rights movement in the history of the world, and that what we saw, what was laid bare by COVID, affects the rest of the world, and that Black Lives Matter is this movement that it's not about Minnesota or Atlanta. It's about the whole world. It's indigenous populations. It's about how systemic racism and the power structure that's in there, it affects everyone. And so we have had an awakening and an awareness, and we now need to do the work to make a more just and equitable world.
No, and it comes down to simply just like treat people the way you want to be treated.
Yeah, this is the foundation of the world's religions. I mean, how did we lose that track?
People get so caught up in like, where's the money going and what's the thing like that? And I'm like, just like, here's the whole thing. Like, and I'll just keep it super simple. Sometimes when people like tell me they don't see racism or thing of that, and I'm like, okay, cool. You know what? Let's pretend you and your friends who you are right now, all of a sudden are all Black friends driving through Alabama. Would you want that or not want that? Like, it's interesting to see how people react, because subconsciously in their mind, they all of a sudden understand really quickly that the dynamic has shifted. If all of a sudden, if it's a car of all white people driving through Alabama versus a car of all Black people driving through Alabama. And so you can sit there and they can argue it however they want to, but it comes down to the Jane Elliott argument, of like, okay, which one of you wants to trade places? Like, you want to go trade places like that, like that's where it is. And so most people understand like that's a place that they don't necessarily want to be. So then you have to look at that and be like, what can we do to change that? And I think that's kind of like a great place to kind of leave it for today. And it's like, what can we do to change that?
Yeah, be in it together. So there's be there for your friends and the people that you're with. Stand up for injustice. Be polite. All these things are great ways to live, and that yeah. And hopefully, once everything settles down, we can get out in the mountains again with our friends, and those are like what we all benefit from it. And that's, at the end of the day, I always come back to being outdoors. So, Stan, when you and I get out there, and we got to do it one of these days, you and I have to trust on each other. So we're counting on the support of your fellow person to have an experience that is recreation. And so, whereas if you and I were to play tennis or something, one of us would lose and one of us would win. And it leaves a different way of humans connecting and understanding with each other. When you're outdoors, the adversary is gravity, nature, the storms. We don't want to sort of engineer our way out of it. We want to accept it and come to terms on that and let that be a way in which we can increase our communication with other humans.
Okay, well, you pack the snacks, and Conrad, I got you guys.
We'll get after it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Well, thanks for joining me today. I really appreciate this talk. I want to thank all the people, Zena, Jamie, Hiram, Kyle, Sandra, for putting this on, because there's a lot of people who are helping out on this behind the scenes, not just you and I. It takes a village. So those people really need. Thank you for that. Thank you for the North Base for trusting me to come and have these talks and hear our opinions, and for just joining me, Conrad. It's been 20 years. Has been too long to get to this point, but man, hopefully, like 21, we're gonna make some stuff happen.
Yeah, we'll do a pull up for Alex, and yeah, shout out to the team out at Memphis Rocks for doing all that you do, and that model of Memphis Rocks. Let's keep that flywheel going. And thanks, Stan, for having me on. We'll look forward to your next guest, and yeah, let's all be one together.
Okay. Talk to you later.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks, team.